Master Bates, or Pandemonium, or Tahani al-Jamil from The Good Place, was also attentive to the play, but being of a more excitable nature than his accomplished friend, it was observable that he more frequently applied himself to the gin and water, and moreover indulged in many jests and irrelevant remarks, as all highly unbecoming the scientific rubber. Indeed, the artful, presuming upon their close attachment, more than once took occasion to reason gravely with his companion upon these improprieties. All of which remonstrances Master Bates took in extremely good part, merely requesting his friend to be blowed, or to insert his hand in a sack, or replying with some other neatly tuned witticism of a similar kind, the happy application of which excited considerable admiration in the mind of Mr. Chitling. It was remarkable that the latter gentleman and his partner invariably lost, and that the circumstance, so far from angering Master Bates, appeared to afford him the highest amusement, inasmuch as he laughed most uproariously at the end of every deal, and protested that he had never seen such a jolly game in all his born days. "That's 2 doubles and the rub," said Mr. Chitling with a very long face, as he drew half a crown from his waistcoat pocket. "I never see such a feller as you, Jack. You win everything. Even when we've good cards, Charlie and I can't make nothing of 'em." Either the matter or manner of this remark, which was made very ruefully, delighted Charlie Bates so much that his consequent shout of laughter roused Mr. Fagin, from his reverie, and induced him to inquire what was the matter. "Matter, Fagin?" cried Charlie. "I wish you had watched the play. Tommy Chitling hasn't won a point, and I went partners with him against the Artful and Dumb." "Eh?" said Mr. Fagin with a grin, which sufficiently demonstrated that he was at no loss to understand the reason. "Try him again, Tom. Try him again." "No more of it for me, thank you, Fagin," replied Mr. Chitling. "I've had enough. That here Dodger is such a run of luck that there's no standing against him." "My dear," replied Mr. Fagin, "you must get up very early in the morning to win against the Dodger." "Morning?" said Charlie Bates. "You must put your boots on overnight, and have a telescope at each eye, and an opera glass between your shoulders, if you want to come over him." Mr. Dawkins received these handsome compliments with much philosophy, and offered to cut any gentleman in company for the first picture card at $1 a time, nobody accepting the challenge, I should say, and his pipe being by this time smoked out, he proceeded to amuse himself by sketching a ground plan of Newgate on the table, with a piece of chalk which had served him in lieu of counters, whistling, meantime, with peculiar shrillness. Dickens addresses Cupid, and Faith, Renaissance figures, and in direction of New Testament. Says, "Me." "How precious dull you are, Tommy," said the Dodger, stopping short when there had been a long silence, and addressing Mr. Chitling. "What do you think he's thinking of, Fagin?" "How should I know, my dear?" replied Mr. Fagin, looking round as he plied the bellows. "About his losses, maybe? Or the little retirement in the country that he's just left? Eh?" "Is that it, my dear?" "Not a bit of it," replied the Dodger, stopping the subject of discourse as Mr. Chitling was about to reply. "What do you say, Charlie?" "I should say," replied Master Bates with a grin, "that he was uncommon sweet upon Betsy. See how he's blushing? Oh, my eye, he's a merry-go-rounder. Tommy Chitling's in love. Oh, Fagin, what a spree!" Thoroughly overpowered with the notion of Mr. Chitling being the victim of the tender passion, Master Bates threw himself back in his chair with such violence that he lost his balance, and pitched over upon the floor, where, the accident abating nothing of his merriment, he lay at full length till his laugh was over, when he resumed his former position and began another. "Never mind him, my dear," said Mr. Fagin, winking at Mr. Dawkins, and giving Master Bates a reproving tap with the nozzle of the bellows. "Betsy's a fine girl. Stick up to her, Tom. Stick up to her." "What I mean to say, Fagin," replied Mr. Chitling, very red in the face, "is that that isn't anything to anybody here." "No more it is," replied Mr. Fagin. "Charlie will talk. Don't mind him, my dear, don't mind him. Betsy's a fine girl. Do as she bids you, Tom, and you'll make your fortune." "So I do as she bids me," replied Mr. Chitling. "I shouldn't have been milled if it hadn't been for her advice. But it turned out a good job for you, didn't it, Fagin? And what's 6 weeks of it? It must come some time or another, and why not in the winter time, when you don't want to go out a-walking so much, eh, Fagin?" "Eh, to be sure, my dear," replied Mr. Fagin. "You wouldn't mind it again, Tom, would you?" asked the Dodger, winking upon Charlie and Mr. Fagin. "If Bet was all right." "I mean to say that I shouldn't," replied Tom angrily. "There, now, eh? Who will say as much as that? I should like to know. Eh, Fagin?" "Nobody, my dear," replied Mr. Fagin. "Not a soul, Tom. I don't know one of 'em that would do it besides you. Not one of 'em, my dear. I might have got clear off if I'd split upon her, mightn't I, Fagin?" angrily pursued the poor half-witted dupe. "A word from me would have done it, wouldn't it, Fagin?" "To be sure it would, my dear," replied Mr. Fagin. "But I didn't blab it, did I, Fagin?" demanded Tom, pouring question upon question with great volubility. "No, no, to be sure," said Mr. Fagin. "You are too stout-hearted for that. A deal too stout, my dear." "Perhaps I was," rejoined Tom, looking round. "And if I was, what's to laugh at in that? Eh, Fagin?" Mr. Fagin, perceiving that Mr. Chitling was considerably roused, hastened to assure him that nobody was laughing, and to prove the gravity of the company, appealed to Master Bates, the principal offender, but unfortunately Charlie, in opening his mouth to reply that he was never more serious in his life, was unable to prevent the escape of such a violent roar that the abused Mr. Chitling, without any preliminary ceremonies, rushed across the room and aimed a blow at the offender, who, being skilful in evading pursuit, ducked to avoid it, and chose his time so well that it lighted on the chest of the merry old gentleman, and caused him to stagger to the wall, where he stood panting for breath, while Mr. Chitling looked on in intense dismay. "Hark!" cried the Dodger at this moment. "I heard the tinkler." Catching up the light, he crept softly upstairs. The bell rang again, with some impatience, while the party were in darkness. After a short pause, the Dodger reappeared and whispered Fagin mysteriously. "What?" cried Mr. Fagin. "Alone?" The Dodger nodded in the affirmative, and shading the flame of the candle with his hand, gave Charlie Bates a private intimation in dumb show that he had better not be funny just then. Having performed this friendly office, he fixed his eyes on Mr. Fagin's face and waited his directions. The old man bit his yellow fingers and meditated for some seconds, his face working with agitation the while, as if he dreaded something and feared to know the worst. At length he raised his head. "Where is he?" he asked. The Dodger pointed to the floor above and made a gesture as if to leave the room. "Yes," said Mr. Fagin, answering the mute inquiry. "Bring him down." "Hush! Quiet, Charlie. Gently, Tom. Scarce, scarce." This brief direction to Charlie Bates and his recent antagonist to retire was softly and immediately obeyed. There was no sound of their whereabouts when the Dodger descended the stairs bearing the light in his hand, and followed by a man in a coarse smock frock, who, after casting a hurried glance round the room, pulled off a large shawl which had concealed the lower portion of his face, and disclosed, all haggard, unwashed, and unshaven, the features of Flash Toby Crackit. "How are you, faggy?" said the worthy, nodding to Mr. Fagin. "Pop that shawl away in my castor, Dodger, so that I may know where to find it when I cut. That's the time of day. You'll be a fine young craftsman for the file fa ha ha ha. You'll be a fine young craftsman man afore the old file now. You'll be a fine young cracksman afore the old file now. You'll be a fine young cracksman afore the old file now. With these words, he pulled up the smock frock, and winding it round his middle, drew a chair to the fire, and placed his feet upon the hob. See there, faggy, he said, pointing disconsolately to his top boots. Not a drop of day in Martin since you know when, not a bubble of blacking by. But don't look at me that way, man, all in good time. I can't talk about business till I've eaten and drank. So produce the sustenance, and let's have a quiet fill-out for the first time these 3 days. Mr. Fagin motioned to the Dodger to place what eatables there were upon the table, and seating himself opposite the housebreaker, waited his leisure. To judge from appearances, Toby was by no means in a hurry to open the conversation. At first Mr. Fagin contented himself with patiently watching his countenance, as if to gain from its expression some clue to the intelligence he brought, but in vain. He looked tired and worn, but there was the same complacent repose upon his features that they always wore, and through dirt and beard and whisker there still shone unimpaired the self-satisfied smirk of Flash Toby Crackit. Then Mr. Fagin, in an agony of impatience, watched every morsel he put into his mouth, pacing up and down the room meanwhile in irrepressible excitement. It was all of no use. Toby continued to eat with the utmost outward indifference, until he could eat no more, and then ordering the artful Dodger, only Dodger, ordering the Dodger out, closed the door, mixed a glass of spirits and water, and composed himself for talking. First and foremost, faggy, said Toby. Yes, yes, interposed Mr. Fagin, drawing up his chair. Mr. Crackit stopped to take a draught of spirits and water. This is very difficult to read. And to declare that the gin was excellent, and then placing his feet against the low mantelpiece, so as to bring his boots to about the level of his eye, quietly resumed. First and foremost, faggy, said the housebreaker, how's Bill? What? Screamed Mr. Fagin, starting from his seat. Why, you don't mean to say, began Toby, turning pale. Mean? Cried Mr. Fagin, stamping furiously on the ground. Where are they? Sykes and the boy, where are they? Where have they been? Where are they hiding? Why have they not been here? The crack failed, said Toby faintly. I know it, replied Mr. Fagin, tearing a newspaper from his pocket and pointing to it. What more? They fired and hit the boy. We cut over the fields at the back with him between us, straight as the crow flies, through hedge and ditch. They gave chase. Damn me, the whole country was awake and the dogs upon us. The boy, gasped Mr. Fagin. Bill had him on his back and scudded like the wind. We stopped to take him again between us. His head hung down and he was cold. They were close upon our heels, every man for himself and each from the gallows. We parted company and left the youngster lying in a ditch, alive or dead. That's all I know of him. Mr. Fagin stopped to hear no more, but uttering a loud yell and twining his hands in his hair, rushed from the room and from the house. Chapter the 4th, in which a mysterious character appears upon the scene, and many things inseparable from this history are done and performed. The old man had gained the street corner before he began to recover the effect of Toby Crackit's intelligence. He had relaxed nothing of his usual speed. But was still pressing onward in the same wild and disordered manner, when the sudden dashing past of a carriage and a boisterous cry from the foot-passengers who saw his danger drove him back upon the pavement. Looking hastily round, as if uncertain whether he had been hurrying, he paused for a few moments, and turned away in quite an opposite direction to that in which he had before proceeded. Avoiding as much as possible all the main streets, and skulking only through the byways and alleys, he at length emerged on Snow Hill. Here he walked even faster than before, Nor did he linger until he had again turned into a court, when, as if conscious that he was now in his proper element, he fell into his usual shuffling pace and seemed to breathe more freely. Near to the spot on which Snow Hill and Holborn Hill meet, there opens, upon the right hand as you come out of the city, a narrow and dismal alley leading to Saffron Hill. In its filthy shops are exposed for sale huge bunches of second-hand silk handkerchiefs of all sizes and patterns, for here reside the traders who purchase them from pickpockets. Hundreds of these handkerchiefs hang dangling from pegs outside the windows, or flaunting from the doorposts, and the shelves within are piled with them. Confined as the limits of Field Lane are, it has its barber, its coffee shop, its beer shop, and its fried fish warehouse. It is a commercial colony of itself, the emporium of petty larceny, visited at early morning and setting in of dusk by silent merchants, who traffic in dark back parlors, and go as strangely as they came. Here the clothesman, the shoe vamper, and the rag merchant display their goods as signboards to the petty thief, and stores of old iron and bones, and heaps of mildewy fragments of woolen stuff and linen, rust and rot in the grimy cellars. It was into this place that Mr. Fagin turned. He was well known to the sallow denizens of the lane, for such of them as were on the lookout to buy or sell nodded familiarly as he passed along. He replied to their salutations in the same way, but bestowed no closer recognition until he reached the further end of the alley, when he stopped to address a salesman of small stature, who had squeezed as much of his person into a child's chair as the chair would hold, and was smoking a pipe at his warehouse door. "Why, the sight of you, Mr. Fagin, would cure the hoptalmy," said this respectable trader, in acknowledgment of Mr. Fagin's inquiry after his health. "The neighborhood was a little too hot, Lively," said Fagin, elevating his eyebrows and crossing his hands upon his shoulders. "Well, I've heard that complaint of it once or twice before," replied the trader, "but it soon cools down again, don't you find it so?" Fagin nodded in the affirmative, and pointing in the direction of Saffron Hill, inquired whether anyone was up yonder tonight. "At the Cripples?" inquired the man. Mr. Fagin nodded. "Let me see," pursued the merchant, reflecting. "Yes, there's some half-dozen of 'em gone in that I knows on. I don't think your friend's there. Sykes is not, I suppose?" inquired Mr. Fagin with a disappointed countenance. "Non est ventus, as the lawyers say," replied the little man, shaking his head and looking amazingly sly. "Have you got anything in my line tonight?" "Nothing tonight," said Mr. Fagin, turning away. "Are you going up to the Cripples, Fagin?" cried the little man, calling after him. "Stop, I don't mind if I have a drawn there with you." But as Mr. Fagin, looking back, waved his hand to intimate that he preferred being alone, and moreover as the little man could not very easily disengage himself from the chair, the sign of the Cripples was for a time bereft of the advantage of Mr. Lively's presence. By the time he had got upon his legs, Mr. Fagin had disappeared. So Mr. Lively, after ineffectually standing on tiptoe in the hope of catching sight of him, again forced himself into the little chair, and exchanging a shake of the head with a lady in the opposite shop, in which doubt and mistrust were plainly mingled, resumed his pipe with a grave demeanor. The Three Cripples, or rather the Cripples, which was the sign by which the establishment was familiarly known to its patrons, was the same public house in which Mr. Sykes and his dog had already figured. Merely making a sign to a man in the bar, Fagin walked straight upstairs, and opening the door of a room, and softly insinuating himself into the chamber, looked anxiously about, shading his eyes with his hand, as if in search of some particular person. The room was illuminated by 2 gas lights, the glare of which was prevented by the barred shutters and closely drawn curtains of faded red from being visible outside. The ceiling was blackened to prevent its color being injured by the flaring of the lamps, and the place was so full of dense tobacco smoke that at first it was scarcely possible to discern anything further. By degrees, however, as some of it cleared away through the open door, an assemblage of heads, as confused as the noises of a teapot, might be made out. And as the eye grew more accustomed to the scene, the spectator gradually became aware of the presence of a numerous company, male and female, crowded round a long table, at the upper end of which sat a chairman with a hammer of office in his hand, while a professional gentleman, with a bluish nose, and his face tied up for the benefit of a toothache, presided at a jingling piano in a remote corner. As Fagin stepped softly in, the professional gentleman, running over the keys by way of prelude, occasioned a general cry of order for a song, which having subsided, a young lady proceeded to entertain the company with a ballad in 4 verses, between each of which the accompanist played the melody all through as loud as he could. When this was over, the chairman gave a sentiment, after which the professional gentleman on the chairman's right and left volunteered a duet, and sang it with great applause. It was curious to observe some faces which stood out prominently from among the group. There was the chairman himself, the landlord of the house, a coarse, rough, heavy-built fellow, who, while the songs were proceeding, rolled his eyes hither and thither, and seeming to give himself up to joviality, had an eye for everything that was done, and an ear for everything that was said, and sharp ones too. Near him were the singers, receiving with professional indifference the compliments of the company, and applying themselves in turn to a dozen proffered glasses of spirits and water, tendered by their more boisterous admirers, whose countenances, expressive of almost every vice and almost every grade, irresistibly attracted the attention by their very repulsiveness. Cunning, ferocity, and drunkenness in all its stages were there in their manipulation strongest aspects. And women, some with the last lingering tinge of their early freshness, almost fading as he looked, and others with every mark and stamp of their sex utterly beaten out, and presenting but one loathsome blank of profligacy and crime. Some mere girls, others but young women, and none past the prime of life, formed the darkest and saddest portion of this dreary picture. Fagin, troubled by no grave emotions, looked eagerly from face to face while these proceedings were in progress, but apparently without meeting that of which he was in search. Succeeding at length in catching the eye of the man who occupied the chair, he beckoned to him slightly, and left the room as quietly as he had entered it. "What can I do for you, Mr. Fagin?" softly inquired the man as he followed him out to the landing. "Won't you join us? They'll be delighted, every one of them." Mr. Fagin shook his head impatiently and said in a whisper, "Is he here?" "No," replied the man. "And no news of Barney?" inquired Fagin. "None," replied the landlord of the Cripples, for it was he. "He won't stir till it's all safe. Depend on it that they're on the scent down there, and that if he moved he'd blow upon the thing at once. He's all right enough, Barney is, else I should have heard of him. I'll pound it that Barney's managing properly. Let him alone for that." "Will he be here tonight?" asked Mr. Fagin, laying the same emphasis on the pronoun as before. "Monks, do you mean?" inquired the landlord, hesitating. "Hush!" said Mr. Fagin. "Yes." "Certain," replied the man, drawing a gold watch from his fob. I expected him here before now. If you'll wait 10 minutes, he'll be—" "No, no," said Mr. Fagin hastily, as though, however desirous he might be to see the person in question, he was nevertheless relieved by his absence. "Tell him I came here to see him, and that he must come to me tonight. No, say tomorrow. As he's not here, tomorrow will be time enough." "Good," said the man. "Nothing more. Not a word now," said Mr. Fagin, descending the stairs. "I say," said the other, looking over the rails and speaking in a hoarse whisper, "what a time this would be for a cell. I've got Phil Barker here, so drunk that a boy might take him." "Aha! But it's not Phil Barker's time," said Mr. Fagin, looking up. "Phil has something more to do before he can afford to part with him. So go back to the company, my dear, and tell them to lead merry lives while they last." The landlord reciprocated the old man's laugh. You can't call what I just did a laugh. And returned to his guests. Mr. Fagin was no sooner alone than his countenance resumed its former expression of anxiety and thought. After a brief reflection, he called a hack cabriolet and bade the man drive towards Bethnal Green. He dismissed him within some quarter of a mile of Mr. Sykes' residence, and performed the short remainder of the distance on foot. "Now," muttered Mr. Fagin as he knocked at the door, "if there's any deep play here, I shall have it out with you, my girl, cunning as you are." She was in her room, the woman said, so Fagin crept softly upstairs, and entered it without any previous ceremony. The girl was alone, lying with her head upon the table, and her hair straggling over it. "She's been drinking," thought Mr. Fagin coolly, "or perhaps she's only miserable." The old man turned to close the door as he made this reflection, and the noise thus occasioned roused the girl. She eyed his crafty face narrowly as she inquired whether there was any news, and listened to his recital of Toby Crackett's story. When it was concluded, she sunk into her former attitude, but spoke not a word. She pushed the candle impatiently away, and once or twice, as she feverishly changed her position, shuffled her feet upon the ground. But this was all. During the silence, Mr. Fagin looked restlessly about the room, as if to assure himself that there was no appearances of Sykes having covertly returned. Apparently satisfied with his inspection, he coughed twice or thrice and made as many efforts to open a conversation, but the girl heeded him no more than if he had been made of stone. At length he made another attempt, and rubbing his hands together, said, in his most conciliatory tone, "And where should you think Bill was now, teacher, eh?" Teacher moaned out some scarcely intelligible reply that she could not tell, and seemed, from the half-smothered noise that escaped her, to be crying. "And the boy, too?" said Mr. Fagin, straining his eyes to catch a glimpse of her face. "Poor little child! Left in a ditch, teacher! Only think!" "The child," said the girl, suddenly looking up, "is better where he is than among us. If no harm comes to Bill from it, I hope he lies dead in the ditch, that his young bones may rot there." "What?" cried Mr. Fagin in amazement. "Yea, I do," returned the girl, meeting his gaze. "I shall be glad to have him away from my eyes, and to know that the worst is over. I can't bear to have him about me. The sight of him turns me against myself and all of you." "Pfft," said Mr. Fagin scornfully. "You're drunk, teacher." "Am I?" cried the girl bitterly. "It's no fault of yours if I'm not. You'd never have me anything else if you had your will, except now. The humor doesn't suit you, doesn't it?" "No," rejoined Mr. Fagin furiously, "it does not." Change it, then, responded the girl with a laugh. Change it? Exclaimed Mr. Fagin, exasperated beyond all bounds by his companion's unexpected obstinacy and the vexation of the night. I will change it. Listen to me, teacher. Listen to me, who with 6 words can strangle Sykes as surely as if I had his bull's throat between my fingers now. If he comes back and leaves that boy behind him, if he gets off free and, dead or alive, fails to restore him to me, murder him yourself if you would have him escape Jack Ketch, and do it the moment he sets foot in this room, or, mind me, it'll be too late. What is all this? Cried the girl involuntarily. What is it? Pursued Fagin, mad with rage. This! When the boy's worth hundreds of pounds to me, am I to lose what chance threw in the way of getting safely, through the whims of a drunken gang that I could whistle away the lives of, and me bound, too, to a born devil that only wants the will, and has got the power to... Panting for breath, the old man stammered for a word, and in that one instant checked the torrent of his wrath, and changed his whole demeanor. A moment before, his clenched hands had grasped the air, his eyes had dilated, and his face grown livid with passion. But now he shrunk into a chair, and, cowering together, trembled with the apprehension of having himself disclosed some hidden villainy. After a short silence, he ventured to look round at his companion, and appeared somewhat reassured on beholding her in the same listless attitude from which he had first roused her. Nancy, dear, croaked Mr. Fagin in his usual voice, did you mind me, teacher? Don't worry me now, Fagin, replied the girl, raising her head languidly. If Bill hasn't done it this time, he will another. He's done many a good job for you, and will do many more when he can. And when he can't, he won't. And so, no more about it. Regarding this boy, teacher, said Mr. Fagin, rubbing the palms of his hands nervously together. The boy must take his chance with the rest, interrupted Nancy hastily. And I say again, I hope he's dead, and out of harm's way, and out of yours. That is, if Bill comes to no harm, and if Toby got clear off, he's pretty sure to, for he's worth 2 of him any time. And about what I was saying, my dear, observed Mr. Fagin, keeping his eye steadily upon her. You must say it all over again if it's anything you want me to do, rejoined Nancy. And if it is, you'd better wait till tomorrow. You put me up for a minute, but now I'm stupid again. Fagin put several other questions, all with the same drift of ascertaining whether the girl had profited by his unguarded hints. But she answered him so readily, and was withal so utterly unmoved by his searching looks, that his original impression of her being more than a trifle in liquor was fully confirmed. Miss Nancy, indeed, was not exempt from a failing which was very common among Mr. Fagin's female pupils, and in which in their tender years they were rather encouraged than checked. Her disordered appearance, and a wholesome perfume of Geneva, which pervaded the apartment, afforded strong, manipulatory, confirmatory evidence of the justice of Mr. Fagin's supposition. And when, after indulging in the temporary display of violence above described, she subsided, first into dullness, and afterwards into a compound of feelings, under the influence of which she shed tears one minute, and the next gave utterance to various exclamations of "Never say die!" and diverse calculations as to what might be the amount of the odds so long as a lady or gentleman were happy, Mr. Fagin, who had had considerable experience of such matters in his time, saw with great satisfaction that she was very far gone indeed. Having eased his mind by this discovery, and accomplished his twofold object of imparting to the girl what he had that night heard, and ascertaining with his own eyes that Sikes had not returned, Mr. Fagin again turned his face homeward, leaving his young friend asleep with her head upon the table. It was within an hour of midnight, and the weather being dark and piercing cold, he had no great temptation to loiter. The sharp wind that scoured the streets seemed to have cleared them of passengers as of dust and mud, for a few people were abroad, and they were to all appearance hastening fast home. It blew from the right quarter, for Mr. Fagin, however, and straight before it he went, trembling and shivering as every fresh gust drove him rudely on his way. He had reached the corner of his own street, and was already fumbling in the pockets for the door key, when a dark figure emerged from a projecting entrance which lay in deep shadow, and, crossing the road, glided up to him unperceived. "Fagin!" whispered a voice close to his ear. "Ah!" said... said Mr. Fagin, turning quickly round. "Is that?" "Yes," interrupted the stranger harshly. "I've been lingering here these 2 hours. Where the devil have you been?" "On your business, my dear," replied Mr. Fagin, glancing uneasily at his companion, and slackening his pace as he spoke. "On your business all night." "Oh, of course," said the stranger with a sneer. "Well, and what's come of it?" "Nothing good," said Mr. Fagin. "Nothing bad, I hope," said the stranger, stopping short and turning a startled look upon his companion. Mr. Fagin shook his head, and was about to reply, when the stranger, interrupting him, motioned to the house, before which they had by this time arrived, and remarked that he had better say what he had got to say under cover, for his blood was chilled with standing about so long, and the wind blew through him. Fagin looked as if he could have willingly excused himself from taking home a visitor at that unseasonable hour, and muttered something about having no fire. But, his companion repeating his request in a peremptory manner, he unlocked the door, and requested him to close it softly while he got a light. "It's as dark as the grave," said the man, groping forward a few steps. "Make haste, I hate this." "Shut the door," whispered Fagin from the end of the passage. As he spoke, it closed with a loud noise. "That wasn't my doing," said the other man, feeling his way. "The wind blew it too, or it shut of its own accord. One or the other. Look sharp with the light, or I shall knock my brains out against something in this confounded hole." Fagin stealthily descended the kitchen stairs, and after a short absence returned with a lighted candle, and the intelligence that Toby Crackit was asleep in the back room below, and the boys in the front one. Beckoning the other man to follow him, he led the way upstairs. "We can say the few words we've got to say in here, my dear," said Mr. Fagin, throwing open a door on the first floor. "And as there are holes in the shutters, and we never show lights to our neighbors, we'll set the candle on the stairs. There." With these words, Plato, stooping down, placed the candle on an upper flight of stairs exactly opposite the room door, and led the way into the apartment, which was destitute of all movables save a broken armchair, and an old couch or sofa, without covering, which stood behind the door. Upon this piece of furniture the stranger flung himself with the air of a weary man, and Mr. Fagin, drawing up the armchair opposite, they sat face to face. It was not quite dark, for the door was partially open, and a candle outside threw a feeble reflection on the opposite wall. They conversed for some time in whispers, and although nothing of the conversation was distinguishable beyond a few disjointed words here and there, a listener might easily have perceived that Fagin appeared to be defending himself against some remarks of the stranger, and that the latter was in a state of considerable irritation. They might have been talking thus for a quarter of an hour or more, when Monks, by which name Mr. Fagin had designated the strange man several times in the course of their colloquy, said, raising his voice a little, "I tell you again it was badly planned. Why not have kept him here among the rest and made a sneaking, snivelling pickpocket of him at once?" "Only hear him!" exclaimed Mr. Fagin, shrugging his shoulders. "Why? Do you mean to say you couldn't have done it if you had chosen?" demanded Monks sternly. "Haven't you done it with other boys scores of times? If you had had patience for a 12-month at most, couldn't you have got him convicted and sent safely out of the kingdom, perhaps for life?" "Whose turn would that have served, my dear?" inquired Mr. Fagin humbly. "Mine," replied Monks. "But not mine," said Mr. Fagin submissively. "When there are two parties to a bargain, it's only reasonable that the interest of both should be consulted. Is it, my good friend?" "What then?" demanded Monks sulkily. "I saw it was not easy to train him to the business," replied Mr. Fagin. "He was not like other boys in the same circumstances." "Curse him, no," muttered the man, "or he would have been a thief long ago." "I had no hold upon him to make him worse," pursued Mr. Fagin, anxiously watching the countenance of his companion. "His hand was not in it. I had nothing to frighten him with, which we always must have in the beginning, or we labor in vain. What could I do? Send him out with the Dodger and Charlie? We had enough of that at first, my dear. I trembled for us all." "That was not my doing," observed Monks. No, my dear," renewed Mr. Fagin, "and I didn't, and I don't quarrel with it now, because if it had never happened, you might never have clapped eyes upon the boy to notice him, and so led to the discovery that it was him you were looking for. Well, I got him back for you by means of the girl, and then she begins to favor him." "Throttle the girl," said Monks impatiently. "Why, we can't afford to do that just now, my dear," replied Mr. Fagin, smiling. "And besides, that sort of thing is not in our way, or one of these days I might be glad to have it done. I know what these girls are, Monks, well. As soon as the boy begins to harden, she'll care no more for him than for a block of wood. You want him made a thief. If he's alive, I can make him one from this time. And if, said Mr. Fagin, drawing nearer to the other, it's not likely, mind, but if the worst comes to the worst, and he's dead—" "It's no fault of mine if he's dead," interposed the other man with a look of terror and clasping Mr. Fagin's arm with trembling hands. "Mind that, Fagin, I had no hand in it. Anything but his death. I told you from the first. I won't shed blood. It's always found out. It haunts a man besides. If they shot him dead, I was not the cause. Do you hear me? Fire this infernal den! What's that?" "What?" cried Mr. Fagin, grasping the coward round the body with both arms as he sprung to his feet. "Where?" "Yonder," replied the man, glaring at the opposite wall. "The shadow." I saw the shadow of a woman in a cloak and bonnet pass along the wainscot like a breath. Mr. Fagin released his hold, and they rushed tumultuously from the room. The candle, wasted by the draught, was standing where it had been placed, and showed them the empty staircases and their own white faces. They listened intently, but a profound silence reigned throughout the house. "It's your fancy," said Mr. Fagin, taking up the light and turning to his companion. "I'll swear I saw it," replied Monks, trembling violently. "It was bending forward when I saw it first, and when I spoke it darted away." Mr. Fagin glanced contemptuously at the pale face of his associate, and telling him he could follow it if he pleased, ascended the stairs. They looked into all the rooms. They were cold, bare, and empty. They descended to the passage, and thence into the cellars below. The green damp hung upon the low walls, and the tracks of the snail and slug glistened in the light. But all was still as death. Virginia Woolf, I feel her. She's like praising Nancy's cunning or Nancy's athleticism. Because this reads like the story from the first part of A Room of One's Own, where she was wandering around the lawn, the green of Oxford University, and someone, or it was a park, and someone, a beetle in that story tells her to get off the lawn. "What do you think now, my dear?" said Mr. Fagin when they had regained the passage. "Besides ourselves, there's not a creature in the house except Toby and the boys, and they're safe enough. See here." As a proof of the fact, Mr. Fagin drew forth 2 keys from his pocket, and explained that when he first went downstairs, he'd locked them in, to prevent any intrusion on the conference. This accumulated testimony effectually staggered Mr. Monks. His protestations had gradually become less and less vehement as they proceeded in their search without making any discovery. And now he gave vent to several very grim laughs, and confessed it could only have been his excited imagination. He declined any renewal of the conversation, however, for that night, suddenly remembering that it was past 1 o'clock, and so the amiable couple parted.